Would you like to hear my song? I'm afraid it's rather long. Of the famous on to Richmond double trouble. Of the half a dozen trips and a half a dozen slips and the very latest bursting of the bubble. 'Tis pretty hard to sing, and like a round ring, 'tis a dreadful knotty puzzle to unravel. Though all the papers swore when we touched Virginia shore that Richmond was a hard road to travel. Then pull off your greatcoat and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel. Then pull off your greatcoat and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel, I believe. First McDowell bold and gay set forth the shortest way by Manassas in the pleasant summer weather, but unfortunately ran on a Stonewall foolish man and had a rocky journey altogether. And he found it rather hard to ride or Beauregard, and Johnson proved a deuce of a bother. And it was clear beyond a doubt that he didn't like the route, and a second time would have to try another. Then pull off your greatcoat and roll up your sleeve, for Manassas is a hard road to travel. Manassas gave his fits and Bull Run made his grieve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel, I believe. Then McClellan followed soon, boat and spade and balloon, to try the peninsular approaches. But one and all agreed that his best rate of speed was no faster than the slowest of slow coaches. Instead of easy ground at Williamsburg he found a long street, indeed nothing shorter. And it put him in the dumps that spades wasn't trumps, and the hills he couldn't level as he oughter. Then pull off your greatcoat, roll up your sleeve, for Longstreet is a hard road to travel. Lay down the shovel and throw away the spade, for Richmond is a hard road to travel, I'm afraid.
Performed here by Dennis Kennedy, Richmond is a Hard Road to Travel manages to combine a whimsical insouciance with cutting understatement to create a pointed indictment of what Southerners like to think was the innately unmilitary nature of the vile Yankee race. Situated less than 100 air miles from Washington, D.C., a distance modern-day motorists can cover in an hour and a half, and even the trains of the period could manage in 4 or 5 hours, Richmond, Virginia would indeed prove an elusive objective for Northern armies. Its conquest would ultimately require the entire 4-year duration of the Civil War. Many factors would go to explaining this seeming anomaly, but no list would be complete without reference to one figure in particular, General George B. McClellan, whose strategic and tactical failures during the first concerted campaign against Richmond would cast a dark shadow over all subsequent attempts. Though a brilliant administrator whose crowning achievement was the organizing, equipping, and training of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan's shortcomings as a battlefield commander would quickly reveal themselves, and his refusal to acknowledge them would arguably prolong the war still further. We turn now to Part 3 of Fateful Lightning by William Hillenbrand, and a chapter titled Slow Going on the York. While out west, Ulysses S. Grant was making up his mind that only the hammer blows of total war would defeat the Confederacy. East of the Appalachians, one Union general remained confident that a single brilliant victory would seize Richmond and subdue the rebellion once and for all. He was George B. McClellan, now in command of the Army of the Potomac. The army was, on the face of it, an immensely potent weapon. 100,000 men organized into 4 corps, drilled and disciplined, superbly armed and equipped and supported by 300 field guns. All winter long, President Lincoln had been more or less patiently urging McClellan to take action against the rebellion. Back in February, Lincoln had gone so far as to write a general order for all the armies of the Republic. On February 22nd, Washington's birthday, a general offensive was to begin in every theater of war. It was an ambitious plan, though nothing much came of it. If nothing else, however, it revealed Lincoln's strategic thinking. The North clearly had a powerful superiority in numbers and industrial capacity. The way to conquer the South was to press its armies at every possible point simultaneously. But the 2 men who would later realize that plan, Grant and Sherman, were just then out west between the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. In charge on the Potomac, McClellan was sure that Richmond was the strategic key. A West Pointer who had graduated at the top of his class, he was thought brilliant by many, himself among them. Still, he might have taken a page from the book of self-taught Bedford Forrest. War means fighting, and fighting means killing. The will to make that kind of aggressive war, however, was not in McClellan's nature, and the plan of action he presented to Lincoln in March showed it. Instead of marching down to Manassas and bringing Joseph E. Johnston's army to battle there, Lincoln's idea, he wanted to transport his army down the Potomac and across Chesapeake Bay, landing at Urbana at the mouth of the Rappahannock River. There, he reasoned, he would be closer to Richmond than Johnston. Johnston would have to come out of his trenches at Manassas and hike a long way across country to defend his capital. McClellan, if he hurried, might even get Richmond without a fight. Lincoln, whose sum total of military experience was a brief stint as captain of militia back in the Black Hawk War, disliked the plan. First, it meant that, with McClellan at Urbana, Johnston would be closer to Washington than McClellan was to Richmond. Second, and perhaps more important, it meant that Little Mac was missing the point: to get at Joe Johnston and strike him a blow. In the end, the plan was made irrelevant by Johnston himself, who withdrew from Manassas and took up a new line south of the Rappahannock. It was a withdrawal that exasperated Jefferson Davis, who was growing as impatient with his commander as Lincoln was with McClellan. Despite Lincoln's insistence that the surest way to Richmond was still an overland road, McClellan now argued for another crossing of the Chesapeake, this time landing at Fort Monroe, at the tip of the peninsula formed by the York and the James rivers. Once safely landed, he would march up the peninsula and into Richmond 70 miles to the northwest. Perhaps concluding that any movement was better than none, Lincoln reluctantly agreed to the plan, insisting on one proviso: that enough manpower be held in and around Washington to prevent a Confederate thrust against the national capital. On March 17, 1862, the Army of the Potomac, now 120,000 strong, was finally in motion. "I will now bring you face to face with the rebels," Little Mac told his men. "I am to watch over you as a parent over his children, and you know that your general loves you from the depths of his heart. It will be my care to gain success with the least possible loss." It was a humane little speech, but it struck an oddly unwarlike tone for the commencement of a military campaign. Once landed at Fort Monroe, McClellan confronted his first enemy, not rebels, but the peninsula itself. The low ground between the York and James was an overgrown, vine-tangled, bottomless bog. Worse, very few of the features in the landscape were where McClellan's maps said they should be. It was truly slow going on the York. By April 5th, the Army's lead elements had made their way only as far as Yorktown, resonant in the memory of both sides as the field where Washington's victory over Cornwallis had won the nation's independence. At last the Army of the Potomac was face to face with the rebels. In earthworks before the city were 13,000 Confederates under John Bankhead Magruder. Known as Prince John, he was a handsome, flamboyant Mexican War veteran who enjoyed the good life and loved amateur theatricals. The play he was about to perform for Little Mac would be a great triumph. Vastly outnumbered, Magruder would manage to persuade the Federal commander that Yorktown was in fact held in force. By day he kept up steady artillery fire, rattling guns from position to position. By night he had bands play gaily as if for a large audience. Well in sight of Union lines, he had one luckless Alabama unit march out of cover into the open, then back into cover, then back to the starting point to repeat the loop, all day long. By this ruse, a battalion became a brigade, and a brigade a division. McClellan, already inclined to take counsel of his fears, concluded that he was now facing probably not less than 100,000 men, and possibly more. It was a conclusion helped along by the fact that for months he had been fed wildly inflated estimates of rebel strength by the famous detective Allan Pinkerton. Yorktown that day might have been overwhelmed in one determined rush. Instead, it was held by an old charade. McClellan, much to Lincoln's dismay, decided that Yorktown could only be reduced by siege. He set in motion the laborious machinery for bringing up his guns, especially the ponderous 10-inch and 13-inch siege mortars. It would be nearly a month before he would be in position to fire the first shot. To McClellan, the commander-in-chief wired not an order exactly, but an urgent direction. "I think you had better break the enemy's line at once. By delay, the enemy will relatively gain upon you. It is indispensable to you that you strike a blow. The country will not fail to note, is now noting, that the present hesitation to move upon an entrenched enemy is but the story of Manassas repeated. I have never written you in greater kindness of feeling than now, nor with a fuller purpose to sustain you. But you must act." McClellan had a Confederate enemy on his front, but he had, after all, an enemy in his rear as well, the so-called radical Republicans in Congress. Believing McClellan sympathetic to the South and to slavery, they wanted either aggressive and immediate action or McClellan's head, and perhaps both would please them best. Despite Lincoln's urging, however, the extent of McClellan's action was to continue preparations for a siege, and to write testily to his wife, "The President very coolly telegraphed me that he thought I had better break the enemy lines at once. I was much tempted to reply that he had better come and do it himself." Little Mac put his army to the business of building earthworks that, as he put it, may almost be called gigantic. He even sent aloft a technological marvel, a hydrogen-filled balloon with Professor Thaddeus Lowe aboard as observer. By the end of April, as the work dragged on, he would get a good look at the arrival of Joe Johnston's army, just as Lincoln had predicted. Johnston, however, saw clearly how vulnerable Yorktown was. Indeed, he thought that no one but McClellan would have hesitated to attack. Johnston, whose army was but half McClellan's, counseled withdrawal to the works now being readied before Richmond, but Jefferson Davis, with his chief military adviser, Robert E. Lee, insisted on holding a line on the peninsula as long as possible. By May 3rd, McClellan had at last got his guns in place, ready to hammer Yorktown into submission. That night, however, it was Confederate artillery that did the hammering, shelling Federal positions all along the line. The next morning the rebels were gone. Under cover of artillery fire, Johnston had slipped away in the night, falling back on Williamsburg. Twice now, first at Manassas, now at Yorktown, McClellan had let Johnston withdraw without a fight, a fact that distressed equally both Davis and Lincoln. Lincoln must have been particularly astonished at McClellan's characterization of a month of futile toil in the mud. "Our success is brilliant, and you must rest assured that its effects will be of the greatest importance. There shall be no delay in following up the rebels." On the 5th of May, Little Mac did in fact catch up to the Confederates. In front of Williamsburg, the Yankee pursuit collided with James Longstreet's rear guard. A sharp, confused little fight ensued. The Federals suffered slightly more than 2,000 casualties, and the Confederates slightly less. Johnston continued his retreat up the peninsula in the ceaseless rain. McClellan followed at a prudent distance. As Johnston slogged toward Richmond through the glutinous mud, Jeff Davis grew increasingly alarmed. In the West, April had been the cruelest month, adding Shiloh to the list of Confederate defeats. Corinth, too, was ready to fall whenever Henry Halleck would resolve to press it. Now in the East, with the fall of Yorktown early in May, the Confederate Navy Yard at Norfolk was indefensible and had to be destroyed. Even the once redoubtable ironclad Virginia was scuttled. In the middle of May, her recent antagonist, the Monitor, led 5 gunboats up the James River, hoping, like Farragut at New Orleans, to run the shore batteries, steam up to Richmond and shell it. While Davis was making plans to evacuate the government, batteries on Drew Ridge Bluff, 7 miles downriver, badly damaged the Yankee gunboats and drove them off. For the moment Richmond was safe, but the Army of the Potomac was just 6 miles from its gates. By May 24, 1862, McClellan's men could see the steeples of the churches of Richmond. The Army of the Potomac was in line east of the city, straddling the Chickahominy River, more than 100,000 troops newly reorganized into 5 corps of 2 divisions each. Due north of the city in Fredericksburg were 40,000 more Federals under Irvin McDowell, square on the line of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. If McDowell were to press Richmond from the north, while McClellan struck from the east, the Confederate States of America might very soon cease to exist. Countering this grave threat was a Confederate army under Joe Johnston, now reinforced to 75,000, awaiting the Federal advance in works Robert E. Lee had prepared 5 miles to the east of the city. Throughout Richmond, all was panic, confusion, and flight. The Confederate Congress evacuated the city. The government put its archives and the Treasury's gold on cars ready to roll towards South Carolina when the time came. Richmond was preparing to receive a powerful, perhaps crushing blow. But the blow did not fall. It did not fall because, having made his laborious way up the peninsula, McClellan stalled before Richmond just as he had stalled before Yorktown. Convinced that he now faced 200,000 Confederates, again he thought in terms of siege rather than assault. One of his brigadiers, the combative Phil Kearny, took to calling McClellan the Virginia Creeper. Back in Western Virginia, McClellan had once sharply rebuked a subordinate who called for reinforcements and seemed unwilling to take risks and accept responsibility. Now it was McClellan who made the telegraph line to the War Department hum with his urgent calls. He could not possibly take the offensive without McDowell's corps, he insisted. Lincoln's Secretary of War, relentless and remorseless Edwin Stanton, was beside himself. If he had 1,000,000 men, he exploded, he would swear the enemy had 2 millions, and then he would sit down in the mud and yell for 3. McClellan, however, would neither be reinforced nor take the offensive, for the initiative was about to be seized from him by Robert Edward Lee, the courtly 55-year-old Virginian now serving as Davis's chief military advisor. Lee's most immediate anxiety was not McClellan exactly. Joe Johnston, though outnumbered roughly 3-2, stood squarely in his path. It was McDowell and his 40,000 that preoccupied Lee. To keep McDowell away from Richmond, he proposed to go on the offensive west of the Blue Ridge. He would reinforce Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley and turn him loose. In the month ahead, Jackson would tear up and down the valley as if he held title to it, and in the end, he would keep as many as 60,000 Federals from cooperating with McClellan against the capital. By any measure, Thomas J. Jackson was an enigma. Described as a particularly seedy, sleepy-looking old fellow whose uniform and cap were very dirty, Jackson was a relentless driver who seems genuinely to have loved the shock of combat. His men called him Old Blue Light, for the way his piercing blue eyes lit up in battle. They also called him Tom Fool, for his bundle of eccentricities. He rode with one arm in the air to keep from going out of balance. He sucked lemons constantly. He liked to eat standing up to keep his organs properly aligned, he said. Jackson espoused 2 things chiefly: a stern Calvinist Christianity and the Confederacy. His army was an army of the living God as well as of its country. There was a great deal of Old Testament holy warrior in the man. As a commander in the valley, he was nothing less than brilliant. Always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy was his first principle. And when you strike and overcome him, keep up the pursuit. Never fight against heavy odds. Hurl your own force on only a part of your enemy and crush it. A small army may thus destroy a large one, and repeated victory may make it invincible. Jackson's small army, just 17,000 troops, was in truth invincible the whole length and breadth of the valley. In 1 month it marched 400 miles, fought 5 battles against 3 different federal commands, inflicted 7,000 casualties, and seized crucially needed arms, equipment, supplies, plus horses and wagons with which to haul away the spoils. Most important, however, Jackson's campaign sowed panic in the White House. So it was that McDowell was ordered to cover Washington, not to attack Richmond. In this end, Jackson was sure he saw the workings of divine providence. In Richmond at the end of May, another act of God, torrential rain, was going to provide the Confederates a rich opportunity to drive McClellan from their beleaguered capital. The Chickahominy River, flowing southwest to join the James east of the city, was just then up on its banks and threatening to tear away the bridges over it. McClellan was somewhat awkwardly straddling the river, 3 corps north of the swollen watercourse and 2 south of it. If Joe Johnston could, with the better part of his force, fall on the 2 isolated corps south of the river, he could pry the Union left free from the city. On May 30th, the skies opened up again, and the next afternoon, after much delay, the attack went forward through the slop. It was, as one of Johnston's staff officers later admitted, a phenomenally mismanaged assault, largely as a result of confused staff work and wrangling over rank and responsibility in the Confederate command. Still, clumsy as it was, it pushed the Federal left a mile or more to the village of 7 Pines. On their right, the Federals were driven back on Fair Oaks on the York River Railroad. But the arrival of Edwin Bull Sumner's corps from the north of the river stalemated the rebel attack there, and at dusk the fighting died out. The next day the Yankees, reinforced from their right, took up the fight again, and when it was over they had regained the lost ground. 2 days' fighting left both sides bloodied, but very nearly where they had begun. Union losses at the Battle of Fair Oaks, as Yankees preferred to remember it, were about 6,000. Confederate losses at 7 Pines, the rebel designation, were 7,000. The battle was a stalemate, but it had 2 profoundly important consequences. The first was in the heart and mind of George B. McClellan. Although he had apparently never been closer to the fighting than 2 miles, he confessed that he was tired of the sickening sight of the battlefield with its mangled corpses and poor suffering wounded. Victory has no charms for me when purchased at such cost. Historian John Keegan has written of the will to combat, which signifies, among other things, a willingness to bear the bloody cost of victory. McClellan, who thought of himself as the protective and loving father of his army, lacked that capacity. A second consequence of Fair Oaks was a single casualty. Of the many thousands of fateful missiles fired that day, 2 were especially so, for they struck and severely wounded Joe Johnston. The next day, Jefferson Davis appointed a new commander, Robert E. Lee. McClellan professed to prefer this change of command. Lee, he thought, was too cautious and weak under grave responsibility. Personally brave and energetic to a fault, he yet is wanting in moral firmness when pressed by heavy responsibility, and is likely to be timid and irresolute in action. It was a remarkably wrong-headed judgment, and perhaps the only way to understand it is to read it as a projection of McClellan's own anxieties about himself as a commander. For as one of Lee's subordinates sharply observed, Lee's name might be audacity. He will take more chances and take them quicker than any other general in this country, north or south. On June 1st, Lee had already begun to formulate a plan to defend Richmond by taking the offensive. In the generation after the war, the stature of Lee would take on mythic dimensions, making him a marble man, venerated north and south. But in June of '62, all people really knew was that he was a career soldier, the son of Light Horse Harry Lee, hero of the Revolution. He had served with distinction in Mexico and was widely regarded in the old army as one of its most outstanding officers. In fact, when war came, Winfield Scott offered command in the East to Lee, an offer Lee declined when Virginia, my country to Lee, left the Union. His record thus far in the war, however, was not highly regarded, at least not in the Southern press. When Lee withdrew his command from an indefensible position in western Virginia in the early months of the war, newspapers dubbed him Evacuating Lee and Granny Lee. When he strengthened the trenches and redoubts protecting Richmond, the papers crowned him King of Spades. What the papers did not know, however, was that Lee was preparing a line that could be held by a fraction of his army, while the bulk of it pitched into McClellan's right flank north of the Chickahominy. The reconnaissance for this attack was to be one of the remarkable feats of the war. Lee sent his cavalry chief, Jeb Stuart, to explore the Union right. Stuart relished the role of beau chevalier, dressing the part from his knee-high boots to the ostrich plume in his hat, and he was all cavalryman. On June 12th, with 1,200 troopers, he crossed the Chickahominy north of Richmond and turned southeast. 4 days and 100 miles of hard galloping later, he again crossed the Chickahominy, this time over an improvised bridge south of Richmond. He had ridden an entire circle around McClellan's army, gathering information, skirmishing, making slashing raids, taking prisoners, capturing stores, destroying telegraph lines, and occasionally playing the gallant for admiring belles. It was a brilliant raid and reconnaissance. Among the Yankee horsemen in futile pursuit of Stuart happened to be Philip St. George Cooke, a Virginia Unionist and Stuart's father-in-law. Cooke would regret his loyalty to the Union but once, said Stuart acidly, and that will be continuously. Stuart's splendid ride gave him what he cherished, glory. It gave Lee what he needed, sound intelligence. In the fighting at Fair Oaks and Seven Pines, McClellan had shifted most of his army south of the river. Now only Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps remained north of it, with its right in the air. Lee would hold the Richmond lines with 27,000, while marching north of the river with 3 divisions. The linchpin of the plan was Stonewall Jackson, secretly arrived from the valley, and now just north of Richmond. While Jackson fell on Porter's exposed flank, A.P. Hill, one of Lee's most capable lieutenants, would strike his front. North of the river they would outnumber the Yankees 2-1. Of course, that meant that south of the river there would still be 75,000 Yankees opposite a line held by 27,000 under John B. Magruder. Magruder was no doubt a wise choice. He had, after all, held a 13-mile front at Yorktown with a handful of men and play-acting. Lee also felt he understood his antagonist, an uncanny perceptive power he showed throughout the conflict. Magruder would keep busy on his front, and McClellan, he was sure, would not strike for Richmond. The attack was scheduled for June 26. A.P. Hill was in line and ready, impatiently waiting for Jackson to come up on his left. Jackson's army had recently established its reputation as foot cavalry in the Shenandoah Valley, but by mid-afternoon it had still not arrived. Jackson's performance throughout the coming fighting would in fact be sluggish. It may be that after the pounding campaign in the valley, Jackson was simply exhausted in mind and body. One rebel said he appeared worn down to the lowest point of flesh consistent with active service. In any case, Hill, an aggressive fighter who liked to ride into a fight in his red battle shirt, decided not to wait. On his own initiative, he sent his attack forward against Porter's corps entrenched along Beaver Dam Creek near Mechanicsville. Unsupported by Jackson, who was even then just a few miles to the north, Hill's division ran into heavy and determined rifle fire and was repulsed. It suffered 1,500 casualties and accomplished nothing. To Washington that night, a jubilant McClellan wired, "Victory of today complete and against great odds. I almost begin to think we are invincible." McClellan's mood, however, quickly shifted to anxiety when he learned that Jackson was now on hand, his reputation preceding him. If the Army of the Potomac had fought against great odds that afternoon, he reasoned, the odds the next day must be overwhelming. Then, too, he began to worry about the security of his supply line north of the Chickahominy. now threatened by Jackson on his right. Magruder had been active on his left all day also, making noisy demonstrations with both infantry and artillery, so that it seemed to McClellan that he was being assailed everywhere. Despite his complete victory at Mechanicsville and his invincible army, McClellan that night ordered Porter to withdraw. The latter fell back 4 miles, taking up a strong position above Boatswain Swamp near Gaines' Mill. At the same time, McClellan made preparations to shift his base to the James River. He was about to be pushed off the peninsula. The next morning, June 27th, Lee was ready to give him another hard shove, again aimed at Porter north of the river. Powell Hill was to strike Porter in the center, James Longstreet demonstrate on his left, and Jackson come down sharply on his right. Porter would have to respond to the pressure somewhere. If he moved to meet Jackson, Longstreet would make a full-scale attack. Although the ensuing attack was not as mismanaged as the fight at Fair Oaks, it was not managed well either. Again, Jackson was late getting off, and in consequence, Hill's division, fighting pretty much on its own, took a fierce mauling in the marshes and brushy hills. Although outnumbered, Porter's line was strong and effectively supported by artillery. Throughout the afternoon, the Yankees kept up a punishing fire. Near dusk, however, Lee succeeded in getting all his divisions in line and off together. Porter's corps buckled in the center. Then it broke. The Yankees ran in full retreat toward the bridges that would take them south of the river, leaving behind 22 guns and 2,800 prisoners. Realizing at last the seriousness of the threat on his right, McClellan sent help, about 6,000 men in all, but they were too late to do anything but form a rear guard to cover the retreat. The Battle of Gaines' Mill had been a long, violent day, to be sure. In addition to their nearly 3,000 captured, the Federals lost 4,000 killed and wounded. Lee held the field and the initiative at a cost of 9,000 casualties. One rebel artilleryman described the bloody business in the vivid language of the old-time religion that both armies shared. Satan was holding his orgies on earth, and death supped fat on the feast. McClellan, who had yesterday wired Washington of his complete victory, now sent this almost hysterical report to Secretary of War Stanton. "I have lost this battle because my force was too small. I again repeat that I am not responsible for this. The government has not sustained this army. If you do not do so now, the game is lost. If I save this army now, I tell you plainly I owe no thanks to you or to any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." It was an extraordinary message for a commander in the field to send the Secretary of War, and the judicious colonel in the telegraph office deleted the last 2 sentences before giving it to Stanton. Actually, McClellan's report had 1 grain of truth. He had lost the battle because his force was too small, north of the Chickahominy. South of it, he had nearly 70,000 armed men who did nothing much that day but watch Magruder's shams and listen to the distant thunder. But for the Army of the Potomac, that was a moot point now, for Little Mac had made up his mind to withdraw to Harrison's Landing on the James River. Robert E. Lee, however, was very much disinclined to let him go unmolested. In fact, Lee believed that an opportunity to destroy the Army of the Potomac was at hand. To reach Harrison's Landing to the south, McClellan's columns would have to tramp the narrow roads that ran through White Oak Swamp. If Lee could strike them on the flank hard enough, he might break McClellan's army into pieces. At Savage's Station on June 29, 3 miles below the Chickahominy, Lee ordered an attack on a Yankee rear guard of 3 divisions. Magruder would fall on them from the west and Jackson from the north. But Magruder went forward slowly and inexpertly with only half his division, and his attack was easily blunted. Jackson spent the day building a bridge over a creek he might simply have forded, and never got in the fight at all. McClellan's long wagon trains were still rolling south. A frustrated Lee tried again the next day to bring the Yankees to bay. At Glendale, on the fields of Frazier's farm, Lee hoped again to strike McClellan's flank from the west with the bulk of his army, while Jackson pitched in on his rear. Longstreet and Hill got most of their commands into the fight, and a bitter fight it was, at times hand-to-hand. Incredibly, however, Jackson, with 25,000 men north of Whiteout Swamp, was just then taking a nap. At Frazier's farm, Confederates took 1,000 prisoners and inflicted nearly 2,000 casualties, but paid for them with 3,500 of their own. And still McClellan marched south toward safety. By July 1st, Lee was furious. Beneath the courtly dignity was a volatile temper. McClellan was escaping, he exploded, because I cannot have my orders carried out. Now the Yankees were at Malvern Hill, 3 miles south of Glendale, and on good ground. The slope was long and steep, and on the flanks were deep ravines. At the top were 4 Federal divisions, supported by 100 guns. Malvern Hill did not present good odds for a Confederate attack, but Lee, believing the Yankees beaten and demoralized, sent Magruder and D.H. Hill forward. McClellan may have been demoralized, but the Yankee riflemen and gunners were not. The rebel brigades struggled up the slope and into a slaughter. Artillery fire that day was especially punishing, and Malvern Hill was one of the very few engagements of the war in which artillery fire inflicted more casualties than rifle fire. D.H. Hill later thought the battle was not war, it was murder. The next morning, many of the 5,500 rebel casualties were still on the field. A Yankee colonel remembered that morning, "Our ears had been filled with agonizing cries from thousands before the fog was lifted, but now our eyes saw 5,000 dead or wounded men on the ground. A third of them were dead or dying, but enough of them were alive and moving to give the field a singularly crawling effect." No one could doubt the private soldier's will to combat. To some in the Federal High Command, the bloody repulse of Lee at Malvern Hill meant an opportunity to go back on the offensive. The Army of Northern Virginia had, after all, suffered 20,000 casualties in the nearly continuous fighting of the 7 days. The Army of the Potomac, half that figure. The Federals' numerical superiority, despite their losses, had actually increased. Instead of retreating, Phil Kearny argued, "We ought to follow up the enemy and take Richmond. An order to retreat can only be prompted by cowardice or treason." But whatever the motive, McClellan gave the order to fall back on the James. Not a retreat, he insisted, but a change of base. By his lights, he had saved his army from destruction at the hands of overwhelming numbers. The 7 days' battle had been a strange campaign. In 5 fierce collisions, Mechanicsville, Gaines' Mill, Savage's Station, Frazier's Farm, and Malvern Hill, Lee had suffered 4 tactical defeats and gained but 1 tactical victory, Gaines' Mill. But it was McClellan who retreated, and it was Lee who continued to drive on with a hard resolve. McClellan hoped to save his army. Lee strove to destroy it. Lee may well have done so had he been better served by many of his lieutenants, Jackson being the signal example. Under ordinary circumstances, he wrote, the Federal army should have been destroyed. In any case, for the moment both sides would catch their breath. On July 4th, the second Independence Day of a house divided, the opposing picket lines were still close. One rebel remembered the 4th this way: "There are blackberries in the fields, so our boys and the Yanks made a bargain not to fire at each other, and went out into the field and gathered berries together and talked over the fight, and traded tobacco and coffee and newspapers as peacefully and kindly as if they had not been engaged for 7 days in butchering one another." A few days later, the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac were camped at Harrison's Landing. They had gotten close enough to Richmond to hear the striking of the public clocks. There was going to be a great deal more butchering before they got that close again.
Said Lincoln unto Pope, "You can make the trip, I hope. I will save the universal Yankee nation. To make sure of no defeat, I'll leave no lines of retreat and issue a famous proclamation. But that same dreadful Jackson, this fella laid his wax on and made him by compulsion a seceder. And Pope took rapid flight from Manassas' second fight, 'twas his very perseverance as a leader. Then pull off your greatcoat, roll up your sleeve, for Stonewall is a hard road to travel. Pope did his very best, but was evidently sold, for Richmond is a hard road to travel, I am told. Now we are very much perplexed to know who is the next to command the new Richmond expedition. For the capital must blaze, and that in 90 days, and Japanese can be sent to perdition. We'll take the cursed town, and then we'll burn it down, and plunder and get up the cursed rebel. Yet the contraband was right when he told us they would fight. Oh yes, massa, they fight like the devil. Then pull off your greatcoats and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel. Then pull off your greatcoats and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel, I believe. Then pull off your greatcoat and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel. Then pull off your greatcoat and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel, I believe. Then pull off your greatcoat and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel. Then pull off your greatcoat and roll up your sleeve, for Richmond is a hard road to travel, I believe. Then pull off your greatcoat.